My country, 'tis a big, sweet land of liberty. You know, when I told Abigail that I was coming here, she said I would receive that kind of warm welcome, but she said, John, under no circumstances are you to get it into your mind to run for president again. She said, twice is enough for any man and his wife. And Abigail must be obeyed. Now, I was the 5th generation of Adamses to live in Massachusetts. My grandfather's grandfather emigrated from England and went on to have 89 grandchildren. 89 grandchildren. You know, immigrants do that sort of thing. Imagine the Christmas presents, and that's the way it would have gone, because the tradition of giving Christmas presents was from the older to the younger. It was never from the younger to the older, so a child would never give a Christmas present to his parent. It was always the parent to the child, or the grandparent to the parent to the child. So when someone whose last name is Adams comes up to me and says, President Adams, do you think we are related? I always say, how could we not be? And that's true. In fact, I think we found a relative in the crowd here tonight. I'm so pleased that she's here. Now, a lot of people think that the Adams were aristocrats, had a lot of money. Please feel free to come and sit wherever you want. Sit up front. The Adamses were not aristocrats. We were simple farmers. My father had a dairy farm, and he also grew crops. And that's how he made his money. And in the wintertime, he worked as a cobbler. And my mother was by no means an intellectual. She couldn't read. So here it was. We were quite simple people, but yet we had a commitment to life. And we were all raised as strict Puritans. Although at that time the Enlightenment was going through all of our periods and made an impression on us. So many of our founding fathers were children of the Enlightenment. Now, when I was 16, my father sold several acres of his land in order to raise the money to pay the tuition so that I could attend the local community college called Harvard. And my father wanted me to be a clergyman. In fact, my father wanted to be a clergyman himself, but he did not have a college degree. And only people who graduated from college could become a clergyman in the Congregational Church, which was the Puritan Church. And so, when I graduated, I told my father that I did not want to become a clergyman. Oh, he said, what do you want to become? And I said, I want to become a lawyer. Oh, he said, because that was a profession that was several tiers below that of a minister, even then. And my father and I argued about this, and we finally resolved that I would teach school for 2 years in Worcester, Massachusetts, while I thought over my desire to become a lawyer. And tell you, spending almost any time in Worcester, Massachusetts, let alone 2 years, is a very hard thing to do. Is there anyone here from Worcester, Massachusetts? Well, thank God. And you know, I thought that being a teacher for 2 years, or any length of time, would be a complete waste of time. And yet, it was through teaching that I learned my most valuable skill that I was able to use throughout the rest of my life, because teaching taught me how to be persuasive. Because if you can persuade a 13-year-old boy or girl to do the right thing, you can persuade anybody to do the right thing. Are there any teachers in the audience? No? Oh yes, all right. Well, and for all sorts of other reasons, I found teaching to be a wonderful background. And you know, there have been 7 presidents of the United States that started as teachers. And one of the things that came out and was a great experience for me was when I was in 1779, I wrote the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And in it, I put that it was the responsibility of each municipality to provide a school for everyone, not just the wealthy, for everyone, and for the men and women. Because it was always my belief that democracy would thrive with an educated populace. And did you know that 3 years ago, the Massachusetts Supreme Court, in making a decision on the funding for the school system, quoted from something, that passage that I had written. I think that's pretty good after more than 200 years. So, teaching has always been a substantial thing in my mind. Now, after teaching for 2 years, and much to my father's disappointment, I decided to read the law with a lawyer in Worcester. And that was the way you became a member of the bar in the colony of Massachusetts at the time. And ultimately, I set up my own practice in my own home in Braintree, Massachusetts, that little salt box of a house. I had dedicated the front room as a law office. And pretty soon I had a lot of clients, so I moved my growing practice to Boston, which was a big city then. Big city. 15,000 people. That's what passed for a big city in colonial America. The most populous city was Philadelphia. It had about 45,000 people. I gave a speech in Boston about a month ago, and people there told me that now Boston has a population of 15,000 lawyers. But luckily, not while I was there. And you know, it was as a lawyer, as a teacher, growing up and thriving in Boston, that I have to admit that I loved being an Englishman. I really loved everything about England. I loved its language, its literature, its laws, its form of government. Everything about England to me was appealing. And you know, we would start every assembly, an assembly like this, where everyone would sing the song, God Save the King, because to be an Englishman meant to be loyal to the King of England. So imagine, I don't know, 1750, and you're a young man or a young woman, you're sitting at an assembly, and everyone sings the following. God save our gracious King, long live our noble King. God save our King, make him victorious, happy and glorious to reign over us. God save our King. You know, when I sing a song like that, people say, well, that is wonderful. Maybe that revolution wasn't such a good idea. That was a great song. Would you like to hear that at Fenway Park? Another time I remember the thrill and the commitment of hearing that song was when I was a teacher in Worcester. And it was during the French and Indian War. And there was a regiment of British soldiers bivouacked outside of the town on their way to march into Canada to fight the French. And we in the town came out that night that they were there, and we brought meats and breads and wines and beers, and we all sat around their campfire and we sang "God Save the King." And I remember singing it with such gusto and commitment. And yet, there came a time when hardly anyone wanted to sing that song anymore. And for most of us, the king was probably the last person we would have wanted God to save. So, what went so dreadfully wrong in that relationship between the American colonies and England? I've often said that the War of Independence started in 1775, you know, Lexington and Concord, your backyard. But the American Revolution started in the minds and the hearts of the colonists more than 15 years before the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. And it was probably started with the French and Indian War, because after the British victory over the French, there was a huge debt that had to be paid. You might say there was a financial crisis in London, and London decided to solve that financial crisis by taxing the colonies. And the colonies objected for two basic reasons. One was, Great Britain, you just acquired Canada from winning that war. Now, isn't that enough of a prize to justify that debt? And secondly, we in places like Boston and New York and Charleston didn't want to be taxed by a government sitting in London when we had no representatives to that government in London. No taxation without representation. And that controversy got worse and worse and worse. And it was most pronounced in my hometown of Boston, where taxes were increased and the protests were more and more vociferous. Taxes were further increased and the protests became kind of violent. Taxes were further increased and the protests became very violent. And ultimately, the British sent troops of soldiers to be garrisoned in each of the major cities in the colonies, especially Boston, and this led to the worst incident in anyone's memory, the Boston Massacre of March 1770, when a group of 14 soldiers were surrounded and taunted one evening by a group of 500 colonists in downtown Boston. And it was March, and there was snow on the ground, and there was ice on the ground, and there were rocks on the ground, and there were oyster shells on the ground, and everything was thrown at these soldiers. And these soldiers were gradually felt that they were about to be stampeded and killed by this mob. And suddenly shots rang out, and 6 colonists lay dead on the street. The Boston Massacre. And the next day, I was asked to defend these soldiers who had killed my fellow colonists, to defend them because they were charged and arrested for murder. And I knew that if I did this, I would become the most hated man in Boston, even by my own clients, or as Abigail put it, my former clients. And I asked her, I said, Abigail, would you give me permission to do this? Because this involves our whole family, and I had, at that time, 4 young children. And she said, John, you have to do what you think is right. And I did. I did represent these soldiers. and for two reasons. The first being, I didn't want these soldiers to receive a kind of rough mob justice, you know, a quick trial and a sentencing and maybe even a hanging, which would remind the rest of the world that Massachusetts hadn't progressed very far since the days when we stoned Salem witches and executed Quakers. And more important to me, I wanted to prove to myself that we lived by the rule of law. Now, my look on this case was fairly straightforward. It was a matter of self-defense. These soldiers felt that they were about to be trampled by this mob that would probably kill them, and they fired. And that trial, the Boston Massacre, has gone down in jurisprudence history as the first instance in colonial America where the court instructed the jury that you cannot convict unless you are convinced of the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Wow. First time that was ever used in a court. Beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, that's so much higher proof of, proof than not just reasonable cause or preponderance of the evidence. Beyond a reasonable doubt, you couldn't have one iota, you couldn't have one doubt of this person's guilt. If you did have one doubt, even if it was 1%, you had to find him not guilty. So I had to explain to the jury why it is that we seem to bend over backwards, as some would say, and some people still say this, and you hear it all the time. Why are there all these protections for guilty people? Why do they make it so guilty, so difficult to convict the guilty? Why don't you just say you're guilty, that's it? Well, and the reason is this. Because it is of more importance to the community that innocence be protected than it is that guilt should be punished. That whole thing, let 9 guilty people go free in order to allow that one guilty person to go free. That's all started there. So, in the end, 12 of the soldiers were found not guilty by the jury, and 2 were found guilty. But they were found guilty not of murder, but of manslaughter, which is a much lesser crime. Manslaughter meaning that out of negligence or inaptitude or carelessness, they fired their weapons without real intent of killing anybody. And they were so scared they fired their weapons. And so they were convicted of manslaughter. And when the verdict came down, the judge said, all right, I'm going to pass sentence on these 2 tomorrow, and I want defense counsel to be familiar with the concept of benefit of clergy. And the judge gives me this look like, you got that, John Adams? Now, if you're a trial lawyer, they always say, you can be a fool before your own client, you can be a fool before the public, but don't be a fool before the judge. And he's the one who's deciding these things. So the judge gives me this high sign, and then he ends the court for that day. We have to come back the next morning, where he's going to sentence my 2 clients who were convicted of manslaughter. So I say to my co-counsel, the benefit of clergy, what does that have to do with 2 soldiers? Couldn't understand that. Well, the principal benefit of clergy was that in a non-capital case, and that would be a case like manslaughter. If they were convicted of murder, it would be a capital case. But in a non-capital case, if you can show that the defendant is a clergyman, the most that the civil court can do to punish him is to brand his thumbs. The idea being that his own clerical canon law group is going to punish him even worse than what the court could do. take away his rights to preach and all this other stuff. Throw him out of the church. And the most that the civil court could do, that this judge could do, is to brand his thumb. But these were soldiers, these were not clergy. So we went to visit the two soldiers in their cell that evening, and I brought a Bible along, and I said, do either of you know any prayers? And one of them said, oh yes, I do. I was an altar boy in England, and I served at so many funerals. I know the 23rd Psalm backward and forwards. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So he recited it to me beautifully. So I said, good, all right. Now what about you? I pointed to the other soldier, and he said, I haven't been in a church in my life. So I said to the altar boy, can you teach him the 23rd Psalm? Just stay up all night long, teach him the 23rd Psalm. So the next morning, judge calls the court to order, and he says, all right, before I sentence the two defendants, I want to know, Mr. Adams, do you have any evidence, anything you want to say? Yes, Your Honor, I want to prove that these two men are clergymen. And everyone in the court just broke out in laughter. Clergymen. He said, order, order, order. And he said, now what proof do you have? So I got the first man up, and he recited the 23rd Psalm beautifully. Got the second man up, and he got to about the fifth line, and he was really breaking down. The judge said, that's enough, that's enough. I've heard enough. These two men are found by this court to be clergymen, and they should be taken out and have their thumbs branded with an M for manslaughter, and they should be sent back to their units, which I took as a full victory for the defense. And sure, their thumbs were branded. It hurt them for half a day, but they were back. They were back. And I was so happy, and yet I said, oh my God, what have I done to my career? The only place I'll be able to practice, I'll have to go to New York or Philadelphia. I'm done in Boston. In fact, the only thing that protected me from, assault from the angry crowds was that my cousin, Sam Adams, you've heard of Sam Adams? I understand some of you might be familiar with Sam Adams. He was head of the Sons of Liberty. He made it clear that if anyone did anything to his cousin, John Adams, he would personally deal with them. So I was free from that. By the way, people ask me, well, what about your cousin's beer and lager? Did you like that? And I said, really didn't, because I would have my favorite alcohol was hard cider. And I would have a full tankard of hard cider every morning. And hard cider is about twice the alcohol level of beer. And Abigail used to look at me, and I would say, no, it's good for my digestion. As well as my disposition, if you know what I mean. But I've lived so long, and I've had a fairly healthy life, as did some of the other founding fathers, like Jefferson. And one of the things that we did, and we understood, was that the last thing you ever want to do, and we traveled, I traveled from Boston to Philadelphia, I was in Europe, I went to the last thing you ever want to do in visiting a local town, as you're passing through that night, is to drink a glass of water. Whoa. What you'd have to do is you want to drink something that's fermented, that would kill whatever stuff is in in the liquid, and so you went around with a kind of a whatever, but at least you were healthy. At least you were healthy, and that was the most important thing. And my wife Abigail, she would not want to drink the way I would drink, and so she would, when we would go to these towns and taverns and places like that, she would always ask for milk, because milk was regarded as probably next to alcohol as the least germ-filled thing. Now, soon discovered after that trial that instead of being hated by everybody, in Boston the people respected me because I had taken on this really tough case, representing some obnoxious defendants. And I was respected for that, and that has laid a tradition upon the legal establishment that it's okay to represent really terrible people, because everyone needs a lawyer if they're charged with a crime. And you shouldn't impugn a lawyer with the crimes of his client. And I really knew I had sort of survived it all, because 4 years later I was chosen by the people of Massachusetts to represent Massachusetts in something that was called the Continental Congress that was meeting in Philadelphia. And it was a group of the 13 colonies that decided we have so many disputes with England that are getting more and more violent and flagrant and about to be revolutionary. Instead of the British sort of knocking us down one by one and trying to make a separate peace with, say, New York or Pennsylvania, they would have to make a separate peace, a full peace with all of us. And that was the point of it. So I went down to Philadelphia, and I remember my proudest moment as in the Continental Congress was when I was the chairman of the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence. I was the chairman. My principal duty as chairman was to say, "Thomas Jefferson, please write it." But it also involved the right to make edits and suggestions here and there, which Benjamin Franklin and I would look at. We'd look at his drafts, and they were brilliant. They were just brilliant. He wrote so beautifully, and he couldn't speak as well as I could, but he could write 10 times better than I could. And for instance, when Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, amongst them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I objected. I said to Franklin, happiness? Happiness, that refers to a mere emotion. It's not a positive good or virtue. How will people know what happiness is unless we define it in the text, I asked Franklin. But Franklin just laughed. The way he always laughed when he disagreed with me. He was a very annoying man. He said, "John, let's let Jefferson's language stay the way it is, because outside of Massachusetts, everyone knows what happiness is." 2 years later, when Franklin and I were ambassadors to France, I discovered that for Franklin, the pursuit of happiness clearly meant the pursuit of women. Now, being in the library here, I want to talk about my relationship with books, which I always think, next to Abigail, was the great love of my life. You know, when I was president, in March of 1800, I established the Library of Congress with an appropriation of $5,000, where we bought 575 books from a London bookseller, my favorite bookseller, and 13 maps. And people have said, well, why wasn't it called the Library of Congress and the Presidency? Well, number one, I had in my own private library at that time about 3,000 volumes. Abigail used to complain. She used to say, you know, we could be as rich as those aristocrats in Virginia and Monroe and Madison, but for my husband's habit of spending all of our money on books. And it was true. I would buy books all the time. And so the other reason I named it the Library of Congress was I thought that, you know, if you name it after the person or the entity or the institution, they tend to come up with the money that you need, you know. And that was very important. You know, when my son John Quincy Adams was looking at colleges, he visited New Haven, and I asked him how he liked Yale, and he said, "Oh, Dad, they have only half the books that you have." So he went to Harvard. And I hope I haven't offended any Yale alumni in the audience, because I'm sure Yale has more books now. I used to say to my children, always carry a book around with you, because you are never alone with a poet in your pocket. And the most important thing about books, really, to be serious about it, was that it was the only way that we in the American colonies could really get some expert opinion. Because the universities were not research universities like Cambridge and Oxford and the Sorbonne. And there were no major philosophers, no major scientists, except for Franklin, in this side of the Atlantic. All of our most important experts we got to know by reading their books. And they were either books in English or French or Italian. And so that's why we needed those books in the Library of Congress. And I want to tell you a story about the importance of books that actually ended the British occupation of Boston. It was ended by a book. And this is the story of it. There was a young man named Henry Knox. Henry Knox was 24 years old. He operated a bookstore that he called the London Bookshop. And I would go there in Boston, and I would go there and I'd buy some of his books just to support him, because I thought he was such a spirited kid. And he was a kid, 24 years old, but he also looked like a real kid. He had no real physique. He was terribly fat. I mean, he was a very obese, big kid, but he was enthusiastic about ideas. And one of the things that he just absolutely loved was everything on artillery science. And he had ordered from England every book that was ever written in the English language on artillery science. That is, the building of cannons, the firing of cannons, the mixture of gunpowder, the aiming of cannons, everything about cannons he had a book about. Now, British occupied Boston in the spring of 1775, you know, Lexington and Concord. And they had 12,000 troops. They had a navy in the harbor and a big equipment. And surrounding them was the Continental Army, the American Army, starting in Cambridge and circling them with another 12,000 troops. So it was like 12,000 troops versus 12,000 troops. And they had some major battles with terrible, terrible casualties, such as the Bunker Hill, with 1,000 casualties on both sides. And it was a stalemate. The British weren't strong enough to defeat the Continental Army, and the Continental Army wasn't strong enough to throw the British out of Boston. So spring turned to summer, turned to fall, turned to December. And Henry Knox had closed down his bookshop in the spring, and he brought his 14 books of artillery science with him, and he joined the Continental Army in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he was assigned, because he said he wanted to have something to do with cannons. He was assigned a little gunnery unit, but they had a tiny little cannon. A tiny little cannon. Anyways, he had a great idea. And he couldn't stand it any longer. He went to General Washington's, where he was, what would you call it, his post, which is actually the Longfellow House in Cambridge, Massachusetts now. And he knocked on the door, and they said yes, and they said, well, I'm a gunnery sergeant in the Continental, you know, and I have an idea for General Washington to get the British to leave Boston. And they looked at him, you know, a big fat guy, and they said, are you an officer? No, I'm a sergeant. And what was your civilian occupation? I was a bookseller. I'm sorry, the general's too busy to see you today. Came the next day, again, he wanted to see the general, an idea to get the British out of Boston. This is the beginning of December he's doing this. Again, he gets a rebuff. And he goes the third time, he gets a rebuff. Goes on the fourth day comes along, and they already have tired. They know they will get this guy again. So they said, General, there's this young man, he's a gunnery sergeant, and he says he has an idea to get the British out of Boston. And he keeps coming every day because he only wants to speak to you. So General Washington said, well, none of you have had any idea of how to get the British out of Boston. Maybe this young man does. Send him in. So they send him in, and there he is. And they said, okay, tell the general. He says, General, 6 months ago, the Continental Army captured Fort Ticonderoga on the southern end of Lake Champlain. In Fort Ticonderoga are 72 huge cannons, bigger than anything we have, even bigger than anything the British have. We take those 72 cannons, we bring them 250 miles over the Berkshire Mountains, and we set them up on Dorchester Heights. And we have them pointing right down at the British Navy in the harbor and at the British encampment on the shore. And the British will leave as fast as they possibly can. So this staff said, young man, you know, that would be an interesting idea, but it's December. There's snow and ice on the ground, particularly in the Berkshire Mountains. How do you think you can do that? If this were the middle of summer where the grounds were hard, maybe we could think of that. But not now. It's way too late in the year. We'd have to wait until summertime comes. So he said, no. He said the best way to move huge cannons is to move them in the winter, because they're put on sleds and dragged and slid along on the snow and ice by oxen. And he said, well, how do you know that? Have you had experience moving huge cannons? No, I haven't. Well, how do you know that? He said, all my books on artillery science advise that. Your books on, he says, yes, I have every book on artillery science. They all say the same thing. Do you have any of these books with you? Yes, I have one. And he brought them. He'd marked the page, and General Washington said, show me it. So Washington looked at the book, and there was silence while everyone watched Washington read. Washington closed the book and said, give this young man whatever he needs. And on March 3rd, 1776, the British awoke, and they looked up on Dorchester Heights, and there were 72 cannons from Fort Ticonderoga pointing right down at them. The British tried to elevate their cannons on the shore to hit Dorchester Heights, but they couldn't elevate them that high. And so the British General Howe asked for an immediate truce and a parley with George Washington's officers and through intermediaries. Howe said this: if you fire on my ships or on my army in the field, I will make sure that Boston is burned to the ground. But if you give me 2 weeks, I will be gone with all my troops and the Navy. Well, Washington really wanted to fire one of those kids. You know? If you bring 72 of them, wouldn't you want to fire one of them? But he knew he was a politician, and he knew he would not be favored by the people of Boston if he won the battle by destroying the town. So he said, all right. And on March 17, 1776, a date that is still observed in Boston as Evacuation Day. Ah, okay. The entire British fleet and all the soldiers sailed out of Boston Harbor along with 2,000 Tories, people who really could not see themselves operating in an American revolutionary system. Amongst them was my co-counsel at the Boston Massacre trial and the lawyer in Worcester who taught me the law. So these were very established people, people who were friends. And they left. Now what happened to that man with all those books on artillery science? Henry Knox. Well, when the cannons arrived at Dorchester Heights, George Washington was there supervising it. And as usual, Henry Knox was his usual self, and he promoted, George Washington promoted Henry Knox from sergeant to colonel. 6 months later, he promoted Henry Knox to general. And when General Washington became President Washington 11 years later, he made Henry Knox a member of his own cabinet as Secretary of War. So don't think that reading is just for people who sit at home. This made this man's career, and it liberated Boston without firing a shot. Now I'm told that presently you have as a President of the United States a man named Mr. Obama. And I have to say that when I first heard that name, I was very surprised, because I had never thought that an Irishman could ever be President of the United States, because the Irish, as you all know, are far too headstrong and independent to occupy such a high office. Of course, I learned later that Mr. Obama was not of Irish descent, but of African-American descent. So a man of African-American descent is President of the United States. And I want to say that that statement is one of the more amazing things about American politics. Because when I was a founding father in 1776, I was one of the few who did not own an African slave. Almost all the others did. In fact, of the 7 presidents of the United States, only 2 did not own African slaves. Myself, and who else? My son, John Quincy Adams, that's right. And yet, I knew that I had to make a compromise in my belief that slavery was an abomination, a theft of services, a kidnapping, and I had to make a compromise with that hatred of slavery that I had, that the Adamses always had. We never had slaves, because I had to form a nation with the southern colonies. But don't think that slavery only existed in the South. No. Slavery existed in the North. My own wife's father, the Reverend Smith, a congregational minister, had 2 slaves, and he would justify his practice of slavery by reading to me passages from the book of Leviticus, which I told him was unconvincing. And another rationale for this was that it was thought that at that time, slavery was going bankrupt. It was not, the southern plantations were losing money. It was not the way to do business as a farmer or as a manufacturer or anything. And yet that was the belief that we all had in 1776, which lasted until 1794, when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin and unfortunately brought prosperity to the southern plantation system. Now, when I told Abigail that America was so advanced now that we have an African American as President of the United States, she said to me, well, John, if they're that advanced, why haven't they elected a woman as President of the United States? I tell you, that's a good question. I could never answer that to her satisfaction, at least. You know, Abigail would have been a wonderful President of the United States herself, but she never would have put up with all the nastiness of American presidential politics, which has been with us from the beginning. And those of you who think that you're watching television, you're watching these misleading ads, whether who they're for, they're all misleading, right? And think, well, what could be worse than this? Well, it was much worse than this. They regarded the election of 1800, when I ran unsuccessfully for a second term opposed by Thomas Jefferson, as one of the dirtiest elections in history. Give you an example. We didn't have television there, but we all had newspapers. And this was published in almost every newspaper in the United States. And it went like this: John Adams is mentally deranged, subject to uncontrollable emotional fits, I hate that, and at times absolutely mad. And do you know who wrote that? Alexander Hamilton. You recognize that name? The first Treasury Secretary, a member of my own party. And he was really mad at me because I basically destroyed the army that he wanted to build to become a little general. We all thought a little Napoleon. And we were having good negotiations with the French, and I said, we don't need this standing army. I'm dissolving it. And you are no longer its general because it doesn't exist anymore. Well, he was so mad. He wrote that. And it really hurt me in the election for New York State. If I had won New York State, I would have won the presidency. So, 4 years after he wrote that nasty stuff about me, he was killed in a duel with the sitting Vice President of the United States, Aaron Burr. So here's the Treasury Secretary, or killed by a Vice President, and you think today's politics is well, oh, and by the way, I understand that Aaron Burr wasn't the last Vice President to shoot someone. There was a huge funeral for Hamilton in New York City, and when I was asked if I attended it, I said no, but I approved of it. And to show it's just like everything, they even created a sex scandal about me. Now, isn't that ridiculous? They said that when I was an ambassador to London, my fellow ambassador, Charles Pinckney, had hired 4 mistresses, 2 for him and 2 for me. And when I was asked about that, I said, anybody who would think that I would have a mistress, let alone 2 mistresses, had never met Abigail Adams. And charges against Jefferson were just as scurrilous, including the charge that he was an atheist. You know, and Abigail hated all of this. She used to say, when you hurt him, I am the one who bleeds. And American presidential politics has always been an American blood sport, probably always will be, because the presidency is the most important office in the world. But it's so tough on the candidates' families. Now, speaking of presidents, how many of you have been to Washington, D.C.? Oh, good, good. And how many of you have seen the Washington Monument? It doesn't look anything like him, does it? And how many of you have seen the Jefferson Memorial? Yeah. And how many of you have seen the Adams Monument? That's right, none of you. Because there isn't an Adams Monument. They skipped right over me. But I don't take it personally. I think it's more of a regional bias, you know, give monuments to those two Virginians, but forget all about that being from Massachusetts. You know, when Gutzon Borglum was carving Mount Rushmore, with the portraits of 4 presidents, I got my hopes up again. And I went out and 1, 2, 3, 4. Who is Theodore Roosevelt? No idea, hadn't heard him at all. In fact, the only recognition I've ever gotten from the United States of America that I was ever a president of the United States was in 2007 when they issued a gold coin with my portrait on it, and it was a very nice likeness, but certainly not worth waiting 200 years. And then I found out they issued that same coin for all the other presidents. My goodness, thank goodness. You know, some of you who are real scholars will know, well, wait a second, there is one recognition of you, President Adams, in Washington, and that is at the Library of Congress. There are 3 buildings. One is Jefferson, Madison, and Adams, founder of the Library of Congress. Wow. Well, if you ever go to Washington again, go to the Library of Congress and look for this. What you should do is look for my name. Because the building that is facing Congress, of the Library of Congress, has a big dome, a wonderful reading room, and that's called the Jefferson Building. And Jefferson's name is outside, and it goes from here all the way to about here. Big. And across the street is a beautiful, beautiful building, and it's called the Madison Building. And the Madison Building, the name Madison is in letters that large, and it goes all the way the length of that room. Now, behind both buildings is a very sedate building. In fact, you enter on ground floor. There's no major steps, you know, just ground floor entrance. And on each side is a very nice, doors, 2 doors, you know, and beautifully designed building, but not for really show. So the 2 doors were sort of open like this, and there's a plaque right here. And the plaque is about 9 inches by 8 inches, and inside the plaque is the word Adams. Now, don't you think they were insulting me? Weren't they trying to tell me something? But that's the one recognition I do have. So the next time you go looking at the Library of Congress, look to find that plaque. You know, there was the first Continental Congress and the second Continental Congress. And just before the second Continental Congress was Lexington and Concord. And while I was not involved in Lexington and Concord, I know they tried to The British tried to find Sam Adams, to arrest him, and he eluded them. Even though he was captured once, he still eluded them. But for some reason, they were not looking for me at all. Usual, right? I can't even get the attention of enemies, you know? That's a bad sign. But anyways, 2 days afterwards, I went up that trail from Lexington to Concord, and I talked to the people who were wounded, the people who were on the side, and I asked them what they saw. And so then our delegation made our way to the opening of the Second Continental Congress. And in my mind was independence. It has to be independence because of what I saw. And I took all the steps to make sure it was independence. I got it so that it wasn't just New England militias. It was all the other militias. And I got General George Washington appointed to head of the Continental Army. But I wanted to move for independence. And they all thought, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. We can't even have a motion. Can't have a motion for independence. It's too early. Too early. And it took me a whole year until 1776 to have a motion for independence even heard on the floor of the Continental Congress. But in that year of constant debate, I learned who those delegates were from the other 12 colonies, and I learned how they thought. And I learned what I was doing wrong, and I learned what to do. What I was doing wrong was I was appealing to everyone's self-interest. You know, I was saying we have to be free of British domination because the British are taxing us. The British are interfering with our commerce. The British have so many administrative regulations. But men don't fight and die for such small things. I knew that I had to appeal to that desire in all of us to work for and sacrifice for a goal that's higher than ourselves. Not self-interest, but a goal that's higher than ourselves. So this was my argument. I said that by a coincidence of circumstances without precedent in world history, we, the 13 colonies, were afforded the unique opportunity to begin government anew from its foundation and build as we chose a government based upon life, liberty, and yes, the pursuit of happiness. How few of the human race have ever been given the opportunity to plan and implement an entirely new kind of government. It's not based upon a king, and it's not based upon an aristocracy, and it's not based upon a foreign power. It's just based on ourselves. That we were going down a path never traveled before by anyone in history, and that what we did here in founding America would be an inspiration to the world. How could we not take advantage of this chance that we have now and in this place to vote for independence and change the course of Western civilization? Ladies and gentlemen, it was that argument that got those 13 colonial clocks to strike in unison in July of 1776. And it was this idea of America as a completely new kind of government. It got people like George Washington, at the risk of his life and his fortune and his family's security, to take over command of the Continental Army. They got the militias from all the other colonies to join in, especially the militia right here from Massachusetts, Marblehead, Massachusetts, to use their expert nautical skill to ferry Washington's entire retreating army in 1776 from Brooklyn to Manhattan across a foggy East River, and thereby saving from certain defeat the next day. Now, the nation that we founded in 1776 would go on to have many American revolutions in every generation, when ordinary citizens like ourselves would join together in self-sacrifice, not in self-interest, to help this country confront its perils and its challenges and make America a better nation. Now, I want to tell you a story about George Washington, emphasize this point. It's the winter of 1777, and George Washington is about to lose his entire army. And he won't lose them to the British, no. He'll lose them because the Army's enlistments are up at the end of December, and all of his soldiers could just go home because their contracts were up. And they wouldn't be AWOL and they wouldn't be deserters. They would just go home. And the only thing we all knew that was holding this nation together vis-a-vis Great Britain was that General Washington's army of 14,000 troops was still in the field. So Washington was desperate in trying to figure out how to motivate his soldiers to sign up for another 12 months. And so he called an evening assembly, and there he was on his high horse in his full general's uniform, and he addressed the 14,000 troops, and he told them that he had gotten the Continental Congress to award each one of them, if they would re-enlist for 1 year, a special re-enlistment bonus of 1 month's pay. And he stayed there for about 2 minutes, and then he rode his horse back to his troops, and he said these words: "If you will come with me in the next 6 months, you and I can do more together than you could do if you went home and lived another 50 years, and more than your children could do and your children's children could do, because in the next 6 months we can protect and defend this nation, the United States of America, whose liberty will be a blessing for all your future generations." Now, who will serve with me? Washington asked. And everyone stepped forward. And each of those soldiers knew that Washington was no longer talking about $10. He was talking about their souls and what kind of legacy or spiritual inheritance they would leave their sons and their daughters. Now, I'd like to sing a song that was written and performed for the first time in Ken Burns' documentary on the Second World War. And it's called "America, I Gave My Best to You." It was sung by Norah Jones in that documentary. It was sung by an Air Force sergeant at the dedication of the 9/11 memorial at the Pentagon. It goes like this. All we've been given by those who came before, the dream of a nation where freedom would endure, the work and prayers of centuries have brought us to this day. What shall be our legacy What shall our children say? Let them say of me, I was one who believed in sharing the blessings I received. Let me know in my heart when my days are through. America, America, I gave my best to you. America, America, I gave my best to you. Now, finally, in conclusion, I want to, part of the story of America is that we took the best that the British gave us and we improved it. Even their songs. And you remember that first song, God Save the King? Now it is one of our most beloved anthems. And you all learned it when you were in kindergarten. Called My Country 'Tis of Thee. And I'd like you to sing it with me, if you would. And sing it, the lyrics, as if you're hearing them for the first time. My country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my father died, land of thy pilgrim's pride, from every mountain side, let freedom ring. And God bless you and God bless the United States of America. Pertinent, but don't worry. Yes, way in the back.
There was a man who well-acquainted with him also said, I study war, so my sons can study commerce, so that their children can study the arts.
Yes.
And there's one other thing that you did that you totally forgot about. You wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, in which you said we have the right to life, liberty, and property.
All right, all right. Well, I only had 50 minutes to talk. And I lived for 93 years. Yes, any other questions? Yes.
What did it cost to go to Harvard?
Oh, well, that's an interesting thing. My father thought he had worked it out when he sold 6 acres of his farm. And he gave the money for my 4 years of tuition to Harvard. And Harvard looked at it after a while, and they recalculated it, and they said that he had only paid 50% of my tuition. And so I said, well, that's all my father will pay. And so I became one of the first scholarship students at Harvard. Which also means when they had the graduation, you know, you were graduated, and if you were a scholarship student, you were way at the end. I thought that was very unjustified. Very unjustified. But as you know, I was a big supporter of Harvard. Yes, you were ahead of the question.
I know this could take a lot of time. I'm not looking for one detailed account, but if you could just talk a little bit about your relationship with Jefferson over the course of time.
Yes. Well, you know, one of the things that I think Americans love is when there are adversaries, whether you're Republican or Democrat, and you can work together. And we had worked together like brothers in the Revolution, but when we became, when the United States was formed with the Constitution, we became adversaries. I was a Federalist, he was a Republican. I was for a strong central government, he was for states' rights. we discovered that he had published some scurrilous stuff, or got someone to publish scurrilous stuff about me, and that hurt my wife deeply because he thought we were just close friends. So we had a period of time where we didn't have any communication, and I would say that period of time is about 25 years. And ultimately, through a friend, Dr. Rush, he sort of said, oh, you know, John Adams, you should write to Jefferson because he sent you something, and I don't know if you got it. We'll write to him. So I wrote to him, and I had some little pleasantries. And then Jefferson wrote right back to me. And then I wrote to him, and pretty soon we were back. We were back. And it was wonderful. I said that we shouldn't die until we had explained ourselves to one another. Isn't that wonderful? And it was like we were kindred spirits again. And it was one of the things that we observed was that at that time there were books coming out on the American Revolution, and the histories were so, we always thought were faulty, but one of the things that marked all of them was that they made the American Revolution and our success so inevitable. You know, we did this and we did that and we did this and we did that, as if it was all planned. And yet Jefferson and I knew we were making it up as we were going along, and we didn't know whether we were going to have a victory or we'd be hung the next week. I mean, it was that close to defeat for years and years. And we used to say, look at that. They just think it was all done. I wrote 300 letters to Jefferson. He wrote 100 letters to me. When I pointed out that difference, I said to him, why is that I writing so many more letters than you write to me? And he said, because I write better. It was absolutely true. He wrote better. And as you know, the great strange coincidence of history was that we died on the same day, on the 50th anniversary of the founding of America. And people said, isn't that something? I felt that there was something there. So I was. Let me end with a blessing that my chaplain, college chaplain, had. And this blessing went like this: may God give us the grace never to sell ourselves short, the grace to take a big risk for a great good, and the grace to know that the world is too dangerous for anything but truth, and too small for anything but love. All we've been given by those who came before. The dream of a nation where freedom would endure. The work and prayers of centuries have brought us to this day. What shall be our legacy? What shall our children say? Let them say of me, I was one who believed in sharing the blessings I received. Let me know in my heart when my days are through. America, America, I gave my best to you.